Hello, I'm John Krawchuk with the Historic House Trust of New York City, and I'd like to welcome you to a tour of the Little Red Lighthouse that's being offered for our members today. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of this site, the geography of it, as well as the history of the installation of the current lighthouse that's behind me, and the whole background on how this point, this geographic point in Manhattan, was an essential component of the important shipping industry that occurred along the Hudson River. I'd like to first start out with orienting you to where we are in Manhattan. We're located presently under the George Washington Bridge, which spans from the Washington Heights neighborhood of Manhattan to New Jersey, the Palisades of New Jersey. And the location of the bridge, as well as the lighthouse behind me, was very strategic based on the geography of this particular point in the river. At this section of the Hudson River, you have the deepest part of the channel and also the narrowest between New York, Manhattan, as well as New Jersey. And so for those reasons, it was a very strategic point historically in history. Starting with the Lenape that originally inhabited the island of Manhattan. They used this geographic point as an important fishing village, and they would have lived up on the higher sections, which would now be the Washington Heights neighborhood, and would have come down here for fishing purposes. The Lenape were very instrumental in doing agriculture in Upper Manhattan. This area was known as the Field of Maize. They used to grow corn just east of here. And they were here for centuries until the Dutch settled the island of Manhattan in 1624. At that point, Manhattan is known as New Amsterdam, and the Dutch reigned until 1664, when the English colonists ended up overthrowing the Dutch colonists, and we become New York. The geographic point that I'm standing on now is presently called Jeffrey's Hook, and that is the geographic term for the spit of land, a hook that juts out into the Hudson River. It's the reason why the lighthouse is located at this point. This hook would have been a dangerous, rocky concern for the shipping industry, the many ships that traverse the Hudson River back and forth. And so starting in 1889, the first lighthouse pole was installed here. It would have been a simple wood pole painted red with 2 lanterns on it. The lanterns would have been about 10 candle power, which is a very, very weak light, but it was something that allowed them to correspond with the harbor traffic, the river traffic that would have been coming by this site. There was also a fog bell installed on that pole that would have sounded during foggy times. So it was both a sound and a light component combined that helped with navigation along the Hudson River. The 1889 navigational light was here until about 1916, when 2 steel structures were installed on this site with multiple lights on them, as well as a fog bell and a fog horn. And so that was a more modern navigation system that would have been responding to the incredible increase in river traffic that was a result of the Port of Albany having been improved in Albany, which is over 300 miles up the Hudson River, and the large ocean-going vessels that would have been traversing the river back and forth. It's very important that all of these navigation tools were in place to prevent accidents, and because this was one of the narrowest parts before you entered the New York Harbor, it was very important that it had proper up-to-date navigational systems. The 1916 navigation system remained in place until 1921, when the present lighthouse is installed here. This lighthouse is actually not original to this site. It originally was known as the North Beacon Hook Lighthouse, and it was located at Sandy Hook, New Jersey. The North Beacon Lighthouse was decommissioned in 1917 in Sandy Hook, New Jersey, and at that point, the Coast Guard had dismantled and stored the lighthouse. The lighthouse is actually a kit of parts. It's constructed of cast iron plates, about 48 of them, and so the entire structure would have been very easy both to manufacture, assemble, and in the case in 1917, when it was decommissioned, deassemble and store. The Coast Guard felt it was important to continue to improve the navigational systems here on the Hudson River at Jeffreys Hook. So in 1921, they bring the lighthouse from Sandy Hook, where it was in storage, to the present location. And it's installed here, and it's been here ever since. The Little Red Lighthouse is 40 feet in height and consists of a conical-shaped cast iron body, a sub-room, which is at the very top, and then the lantern, which is at the very, very top, which is the octagonal enclosed structure where the lens is held. The lens is actually the heart and soul of the lighthouse. It's actually the element that the shipping traffic responded to. And the original light in 1921 would have been a red light that would have been on a 3-second interval, and it would have been only visible at night. There was also a 1,000-pound bell that was located here at the lighthouse for the purposes of fog when there wasn't visibility on the Hudson River. The fog bell is no longer here at the lighthouse, but the lens and the lantern are still present up at the top, and we'll be looking at that in a moment. We're presently standing in the watch room, which is the room that you access by climbing 32 cast iron steps in order to enter this space. Historically, this room would have been used for the lighthouse keeper. They would have come down here during inclement weather. They would have stored oil for the light in this room. Although this was not a manned lighthouse, as they say, there was no one who actually lived here. But there were several rounds of individuals, men who would have actually had shifts to operate this lighthouse. And this watch room was a very important safe room for them to be in, as well as a storage facility for lantern oil. The way that you access the lighthouse is through a semicircular staircase, 32 cast iron stair treads that bring you up into the watch room where I'm presently standing. Once you're in this room, you ascend this rung ladder, which is another 8 steps, which brings you into the lantern room. The lantern room is, as I stated earlier, the heart and soul of the lighthouse. It's actually where the light is kept. That is the beacon of this lighthouse, in particular, the Little Red Lighthouse. The conical portion of the lighthouse consists of 48 plates. These are the plates that you can see behind me. And it's a kit of parts, as I stated earlier. They're all bolted together, and it can all unbolt. And so it would have been a very practical way for the lighthouse to have been manufactured, shipped, and installed, very often in pretty harsh and remote areas where lighthouses are located. This lighthouse is not unique. There are actually several other lighthouses very similar to this that are located in the Sandy Hook area. And this would have been one of the earliest lighthouses. It was constructed in 1880. Others would have been constructed between 1880 and through 1890 of a similar vintage and style. The lighthouse is 40 feet in height, and the diameter is about 14.5 feet in diameter. So it is a Little Red Lighthouse. It is not big by other lighthouse standards. And nor does it have the living space that would be in other lighthouses at the base of the lighthouse, where the lighthouse keeper and or the lighthouse keeper's family would have lived traditionally. The lighthouse is actually one of the only remaining lighthouses in Manhattan and one of the few remaining lighthouses in New York City. So it is quite special. The lighthouse is a New York City landmark designated in 1991 as an individual landmark. And it also was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1979, which really speaks to its level of significance, both nationally and locally here in New York City. So the space I'm standing in now is the rough diameter of the lighthouse, which is 14.5 feet. It does have entasis, so it does sort of slightly narrow as you go up. So it's possible that we're at about a 14-foot diameter in this space. The ceiling heights are approximately 7 to 8 feet in height, depending on where you're standing in the room. And the porthole windows behind me are a traditional seafaring navigational window design. The exterior of the lighthouse, you can see the actual portholes, and there are also some other really special features that are little aesthetic moments that are quite wonderful in the lighthouse. They're little Renaissance revival styled features around the window surrounds, which are inspired by kind of Tuscan window designs. And the style of the interior of the lighthouse is actually quite industrial and functional. It's meant to, again, be a cast kit of parts. It's meant to be all-weather. It emanates out of the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, where cast iron and iron in general becomes really the ruling material of its time. It's also fireproof, which is very important. And you know, the design on the interior, as you can see, is very rudimentary. It is just very plain and basic. On the exterior, there was an effort to kind of beautify the lighthouse with the window surrounds and, of course, the lantern at the very top, the finials that are located on top of the roof. These are all things that were really important, not only aesthetically, but also to make the lighthouse all-weather and to seal the envelope, as we say, to make the entire thing waterproof and tight, to make sure that it was really going to be able to withstand the very harsh environment in which it's located. So I've now ascended the staircase leading up to the watch room, and then I ascended further up the ship's ladder into what's called the lantern room, and then crawled through a small door where I'm now standing on what's called the gallery deck of the lighthouse. So I'm outside. I'm adjacent to the lantern room, which is on my left. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the setting, a little bit more about the setting for the Little Red Lighthouse. Behind me, you can see some tall buildings through the arch of the George Washington Bridge. Those buildings are the location of the highest geographic point in Manhattan, which is the Fort Washington neighborhood of Manhattan. During the Revolutionary War, a fort was built there that defended Manhattan. And in November of 1776, that fort fell to, the colonists and became part of British control. New York became part of British control for the next 7 years. At the location of the lighthouse, there was actually a redoubt, which was a gun port. There was one gun located at this point to defend Manhattan. So this was an important strategic military site during the Revolutionary War. The history of the location of the Little Red Lighthouse at Jeffreys Hook is an interesting one. We actually don't know the exact origins of the term Jeffreys in Jeffreys Hook, which is, again, the geographic hook that juts out into the Hudson River. It's speculated that although it's an anglicized word, that its origins are actually Dutch. In 1624, the Dutch founded New Amsterdam in what's present-day Manhattan. And the term Jeffreys Hook is suspected to actually originate from the Dutch word juffrouw, which means young woman. What's particularly special about the location and the setting of the Little Red Lighthouse is the natural river's edge, which you really don't have throughout most of Manhattan. Most of it has been hardened and engineered in order to accommodate the occasional flooding of the Hudson River. But here you have natural rock outcroppings, and you also have the sort of, edge that's been protected by large chunks of rocks, but still gives you a sense of what the natural edge would have been here and throughout Manhattan early in its history. I'm presently standing on the gallery deck, and to my immediate left is the lantern room. The lantern room is where the heart and soul of the lighthouse exists. It's where the Fresnel lens is located. That is a lens that has conical ribs on it that allow for the light to be induced into short wavelengths and to be visible to ships, but also to travel long distances. The Fresnel lens was developed by Augustin Jean Fresnel in the late 18th, early 19th century, and this was in France, and became essentially the main source of light for lighthouses starting at that time until the present day. The Fresnel lens is called the lens that saved a million ships, and it's called that for a reason, because it was incredibly effective at doing its job. Again, shooting long rays of light, visible to ships from miles away. It really helped improve the navigational tools that were essential to keeping the very important shipping traffic around the world safe. The lantern room is a room that is encased in glass, actually, glass panels, several glass panels that allow you to actually, as the lighthouse keeper, to have full visibility in the round of your surroundings. So that would have included the full length of the Hudson River, as well as what might be going on behind you, because there could be storms that would be approaching from the east. The structure is 100% cast iron, even on top, the roof. And the finial on top is not just decorative, but it serves the very important purpose of also being a lightning strike. Because this would have been located in a prominent geographic feature jutting out into the Hudson River, this was always a likely candidate for lightning strikes, particularly also because the structure is metal. The George Washington Bridge is an important part of the story of the Little Red Lighthouse, and I'd like to talk a little bit about its construction, which is completed in 1931. As I had stated earlier, this particular point in the Hudson River is one of the narrowest. It's also one of the deepest parts of the channel of the Hudson River as you enter New York Harbor. And so, as a result, it was necessary to have some sort of a navigational light system here. But when the bridge is built and completed in 1931, the lighthouse very quickly becomes obsolete. Ships navigate off of geographic points, and typically those points need to be visible from the ships. And some of the ships traversing the Hudson River are quite large. Many of them are ocean-going vessels. So these have to be identifiable landmarks, often geographical landmarks, but when that isn't possible, there are navigational tools that can be used. So originally it was the lighthouse. From 1921, when it was installed, the present-day lighthouse was installed at this location, until about 1931 and a little bit further sort of into the decade. By about 1938-39, the lighthouse is ready to be decommissioned by the Coast Guard because the George Washington Bridge, its height, and the lights that are located on it served as an even more visible navigational tool for the shipping traffic that was passing by this section of the Hudson River. As we know, New York is a city of bridges. We have bridges over many bodies of water throughout the 5 boroughs. But the George Washington Bridge is probably one of the most famous modern-day bridges that exist in the city, and when it was built, it was instantly iconic. The juxtaposition of the bridge with the lighthouse is a really fascinating one, and I think really speaks to us as New Yorkers. These important landmarks, the bridge, the lighthouse, the Hudson River, which is sort of a natural landmark in our city. And all of those things come together to make this a very special spot to visit in Fort Washington Park. It's very likely that these 3 components is what inspired Hildegard Swift to write her book, The Little Red Lighthouse and the Great Gray Bridge, in 1942. The bridge and the lighthouse are featured as prominent characters in her story, and the Little Red Lighthouse takes on almost a human quality. The story is one of overcoming adversity and the little guy versus the big guy. And in 1942, by then the lighthouse had been decommissioned. Hildegard Swift probably likely realized that this sweet little treasure was at risk. And her book really focuses on that. It acknowledges the special qualities of the lighthouse. It acknowledges the importance of the bridge. But regardless, it's a story about progress, but also survival. The book was an instant classic. It is now known as a literary landmark, along with the actual landmark that I'm standing on now and the landmark visible behind me, the George Washington Bridge. Hildegard Swift's book is now a children's classic that's been in reprint for decades. The illustrations are actually quite wonderful as well, that really show the lighthouse in such a flattering light, but also starting to very early on raise the concerns for the future of this structure. And Lind Ward illustrated the book, The Little Red Lighthouse and the Great Gray Bridge, and those illustrations are now also considered iconic. And they really tell the story of the evolution of this lighthouse, the construction of the George Washington Bridge, and then its perseverance, how it actually survives. And it's so interesting that that story ended up becoming the story of the lighthouse itself, playing out in real life a decade later. Starting in 1951, when the Coast Guard announced that they were going to be auctioning off the lighthouse, dismantling it, and selling it. There was a huge public outcry, and many New York City school children wrote letters to the mayor and to others saying, please save this lighthouse. It really gained broad attention to the point where even Eleanor Roosevelt was involved with advocating for the preservation of this structure. And in the end, they prevailed. Robert Moses, who was the Parks Commissioner and one of the great builders of New York City, was convinced that it was appropriate to take this structure on as a New York City Parks landmark. And he arranged for it to be transferred to the Parks Department. The land was already in the possession of the Parks Department. Starting in the late 19th century, the land was purchased for Fort Washington Park. So it made sense that this structure would join the other great New York City Parks landmarks that exist in our city.